The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Campbell as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stepped off the transport bus, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched across her face. At 28 years old, she had already served 6 years in the Army, but this assignment felt different. She was joining the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, known for its elite standards and unforgiving training regimen. More importantly, she was one of only 12 women assigned to this particular unit. Maria had earned her place here through exceptional performance in her previous assignments. Her file was spotless: expert marksman qualifications, leadership commendations, and reputation for getting results even in the most challenging situations. But she knew that none of that would matter in the first few weeks. She would have to prove herself all over again, just as she had done at every previous assignment. The barracks were a stark reminder of military efficiency. Clean, organized, and intimidating to newcomers. Maria found her assigned room and began the methodical process of unpacking her belongings. Everything had its place, and everything would be inspected. She had learned early in her career that attention to detail wasn't just about following rules. It was about survival in an environment where mistakes could cost lives. As she arranged her gear, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, she had seen more violence and hardship by age 16 than most people experience in a lifetime. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 children while working 2 jobs. Maria had become the protector of her younger siblings, learning to fight when necessary and outsmart threats when possible. The decision to join the Army had been practical rather than patriotic. She needed a way out of the cycle of poverty that had trapped her family for generations. The military offered structure, purpose, and, most importantly, a chance to build a better future. What she hadn't expected was to discover that she was exceptionally good at being a soldier. Her first sergeant at basic training had been skeptical of the quiet girl from the inner city. But Maria had surprised everyone by excelling in every aspect of military life. She was faster, stronger, and smarter than most of her male counterparts. More importantly, she had an innate understanding of tactics and leadership that impressed even the most experienced instructors. Now, 6 years later, she was preparing to face her biggest challenge yet. The 2nd Brigade was known for its old-school mentality and resistance to change. Many of the senior non-commissioned officers had served multiple combat deployments and viewed female soldiers with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. Maria knew she would have to be twice as good as everyone else just to be considered equal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. She opened it to find a tall, muscular man in his early 40s wearing the distinctive black beret of an airborne unit. Master Sergeant James Coleman stood in the doorway, his steely gray eyes scanning her from head to toe with obvious disapproval. "Santos, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Master Sergeant Coleman, your new platoon sergeant. We need to have a conversation." Maria stood at attention automatically, years of military training taking over. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Coleman stepped into her room without invitation, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller. He was the kind of man who commanded attention through sheer force of personality. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots gleamed like mirrors, and every inch of him radiated the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. "I've read your file, Santos," he continued, picking up one of her achievement certificates and examining it with casual disdain. "Impressive on paper, but paper doesn't mean much out here in the real world. This isn't some support unit where you can hide behind a desk. This is a combat unit, and combat is a man's job." Maria felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this speech before, though rarely delivered with such obvious contempt. "Understand, Master Sergeant. Do you?" Coleman set down the certificate and turned to face her directly. "Because I've seen plenty of female soldiers come through here thinking they could handle what we do. Most of them wash out within 6 months. The ones who don't usually end up being more trouble than they're worth." The Master Sergeant began walking around her room, examining her belongings with the scrutiny of a drill instructor conducting a formal inspection. He picked up her combat gear, testing the weight of her pack, and checking the condition of her equipment. Everything was in perfect order, but his expression suggested he was disappointed not to find any obvious deficiencies. "I run a tight operation here, Santos," he said, stopping in front of her again. "My soldiers are the best because I accept nothing less than perfection. They respect me because I've earned that respect through years of combat experience and proven leadership. You, on the other hand, are an unknown quantity." Maria remained silent, understanding that this was as much a test as it was an introduction. Coleman was establishing the pecking order, making it clear that her rank meant nothing if she couldn't back it up with performance. It was a familiar dance, one she had navigated successfully many times before. "I don't care what you accomplished at your previous assignments," Coleman continued. "Here, you start at the bottom. You'll prove yourself the same way every other soldier in this unit has proven themselves, through sweat, dedication, and absolute obedience to the chain of command. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Master Sergeant." Coleman studied her for a long moment, perhaps expecting some sign of weakness or resentment. When Maria's expression remained composed and professional, he nodded curtly. "Good. Formation is at 0600 tomorrow. Don't be late." As soon as the door closed behind him, Maria allowed herself to exhale slowly. She had encountered men like Coleman before, veterans who viewed any change to their established order as a personal threat. They weren't necessarily bad soldiers, but they were often the biggest obstacles for anyone trying to prove themselves outside the traditional mold. She finished unpacking and spent the rest of the evening studying the unit's standard operating procedures and familiarizing herself with the base layout. Knowledge was power, and she intended to be prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. As she finally settled into her bunk that night, Maria thought about the conversation with Coleman and made a mental note to be extra careful around him. What she didn't know was that Master Sergeant Coleman was already planning how to make her life as difficult as possible. In his mind, female soldiers were a distraction at best and a liability at worst. He had successfully driven out 3 previous female assignments through a combination of impossible standards and subtle harassment. He saw no reason why Maria Santos would be any different. The next morning arrived with the harsh sound of reveille echoing across the base. Maria was already dressed and ready, having learned long ago that being early was the only way to avoid being late in the military. She made her way to the formation area, where dozens of soldiers were assembling in precise rows under the watchful eyes of their squad leaders. The morning physical training session was designed to test the limits of human endurance. Coleman led from the front, setting a punishing pace that left even seasoned soldiers gasping for breath. Maria kept up effortlessly, her years of conditioning and natural athleticism serving her well. She noticed several soldiers glancing at her with surprise as she maintained position in the lead group throughout the 5-mile run. After PT, the unit moved to weapons training. This was Maria's specialty, and she felt confident as they approached the firing range. Her marksmanship scores had always been among the highest in any unit she served with, and today was no exception. Shot after shot found its mark with mechanical precision, earning grudging nods of approval from the range instructors. Coleman watched her performance with growing frustration. He had expected her to struggle, to provide him with ammunition for his belief that women didn't belong in combat units. Instead, she was outperforming soldiers who had been in the unit for years. His carefully planned campaign of discouragement would need to be more aggressive than usual. The opportunity came during afternoon tactical training. The unit was practicing building clearing operations, a complex and dangerous skill that required perfect coordination between team members. Coleman assigned Maria to a team with 3 of his most experienced soldiers, ostensibly to help her learn the procedures. In reality, he was setting her up for failure. The exercise began smoothly enough. Maria's team moved through the mock building with professional efficiency, each member covering their assigned sectors and communicating through hand signals. She followed the lead of her more experienced teammates, absorbing the lessons and adapting quickly to their methods. But Coleman wasn't satisfied with her competent performance. As the exercise progressed, he began changing the parameters without warning, adding unexpected complications designed to overwhelm and confuse the participants. Suddenly, Maria's team found themselves facing a scenario that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. It was in that moment of chaos that Maria's true nature began to emerge. While her teammates hesitated, uncertain how to proceed, she assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a born tactician. She recognized the pattern of the exercise, identified the optimal solution, and began implementing it before anyone else had fully processed what was happening. Her actions were so smooth and confident that even Coleman found himself watching with grudging professional interest. This wasn't the performance of a lucky amateur. This was the work of a natural soldier, someone who understood warfare at an instinctive level. For the first time since her arrival, he began to wonder if Maria Santos might be different from the other female soldiers he had encountered. But that moment of doubt only made him more determined to find her breaking point. In his experience, everyone had one. It was just a matter of applying the right amount of pressure at the right moment. As the training day concluded and the soldiers prepared for evening chow, Coleman began planning his next move. Maria sensed the increased scrutiny, but chose to focus on her immediate responsibilities. She was still the new person in the unit, still proving herself with every action and decision. The key was to remain professional, competent, and unshakable regardless of what challenges came her way. That evening, as she cleaned her gear and prepared for another day of training, Maria reflected on the subtle dynamics she had observed. She understood that Coleman was testing her, pushing to see how she would react under pressure. What he didn't realize was that pressure had been her constant companion since childhood. The challenges he could devise were nothing compared to what she had already survived. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them fully anticipated, a clash between old assumptions and new realities that would force everyone in the unit to reconsider their beliefs about strength, leadership, and what it truly meant to be a soldier. 3 weeks into her assignment at Fort Campbell, Maria had established herself as one of the most capable soldiers in the unit. Her performance in every training exercise had been exceptional, and even the most skeptical squad leaders were beginning to acknowledge her abilities. But Master Sergeant Coleman's attitude toward her had only hardened with each passing day. The morning started like any other, with physical training at dawn followed by weapons maintenance and tactical instruction. Maria had developed a routine that kept her ahead of the demanding schedule, always prepared and never giving anyone reason to question her dedication. She had also begun to earn the respect of her fellow soldiers, who had initially been wary of the new arrival, but now recognized her competence and professionalism. Private Johnson, a young soldier from Tennessee, had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for the growing sentiment in the unit. Santos knows her stuff, he told his squad mates during a break between training sessions. I've seen her strip and clean an M4 faster than anyone in the company, and she can put rounds on target from distances that would challenge most of our designated marksmen. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran with 12 years of service, nodded in agreement. She's solid, doesn't talk much, just gets the job done. That's the kind of soldier you want watching your back in a real fight. But Coleman overheard these conversations, and they only fueled his determination to prove that Maria was a liability waiting to happen. He began implementing increasingly difficult and unfair standards specifically designed to break her down. Equipment inspections that were impossibly demanding. Physical fitness tests that exceeded standard requirements. Training scenarios where she was deliberately isolated from support or given inadequate information. Maria recognized the pattern immediately. She had faced similar treatment before, though rarely with such obvious malice. Coleman wasn't just testing her capabilities. He was actively trying to sabotage her success. The realization was both frustrating and oddly liberating. If he was going to make her job harder, she would simply have to be better than anyone expected. The unit was scheduled for advanced combat training that week, a series of exercises designed to simulate real-world combat situations. These were high-pressure scenarios where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Coleman saw this as the perfect opportunity to expose what he believed were Maria's fundamental weaknesses. On Tuesday morning, Maria's squad was assigned to practice urban warfare tactics in a specially constructed training facility. The mock city was complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and hidden sniper positions. It was as close to actual combat as training could provide without real bullets flying. Coleman positioned himself as the primary evaluator for Maria's team, giving him direct control over how the exercise would unfold. He briefed the squad on their mission: locate and neutralize a high-value target believed to be hiding somewhere in the simulated urban environment. Standard procedure called for methodical building-by-building clearing, with teams providing mutual support as they advanced through the area. But Coleman had other plans. As soon as the exercise began, he started feeding Maria's team false intelligence designed to lead them into tactical dead ends. He reported enemy positions that didn't exist, creating confusion and forcing the team to waste time and resources chasing shadows. Meanwhile, he directed other teams to positions that would inadvertently block Maria's squad from achieving their objectives. Despite the obvious manipulation, Maria kept her team focused and effective. When the intelligence didn't match what they observed on the ground, she trusted her instincts and adjusted their approach accordingly. When they found themselves isolated from supporting units, she improvised new tactics that allowed them to continue making progress toward their goal. Her squad mates began to notice that something was wrong with the exercise. The scenarios they were facing didn't match standard training protocols, and the obstacles seemed unnecessarily complex and contradictory. But Maria maintained her composure, calmly working through each challenge as if it were a normal part of the training. Corporal Martinez, the team leader, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "This doesn't feel right, Santos. It's like someone's deliberately trying to screw us over." "Focus on the mission," Maria replied quietly. "Whatever's happening, we can't handle it if we stick to our training and support each other." Her calm confidence helped steady the team, even as Coleman continued to escalate the difficulty of their assigned tasks. By the midpoint of the exercise, her squad had overcome obstacles that should have been impossible for a single team to handle. They had adapted to each new challenge with increasing efficiency, proving their tactical flexibility and problem-solving abilities. Coleman watched their progress with growing frustration. No matter what he threw at them, Maria seemed to find a way around it. Her performance was making him look petty and vindictive, exactly the opposite of what he had intended. He needed a more direct approach, something that would force her to fail in front of the entire unit. The opportunity came during the final phase of the exercise. Maria's team had successfully located their target and was preparing to execute the capture. It was a textbook operation, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. Coleman decided this was the moment to intervene personally. As Maria's squad prepared to breach the building where their target was hiding, Coleman appeared at their position with new orders. "Change of plans," he announced. "Santos, you're taking point on this entry. Your team will provide support from the outside while you go in alone and secure the target." The order violated every principle of tactical operations. Solo entries were extremely dangerous and rarely attempted outside of special circumstances. Maria's squad mates immediately recognized the problem and began to voice their objections. "Master Sergeant, that's not standard procedure," Corporal Martinez said carefully. "We should maintain team integrity for the breach." "Are you questioning my judgment, Corporal?" Coleman's voice carried a dangerous edge that suggested disagreement would not be tolerated. "No, Master Sergeant, but then Santos takes point alone, unless she's not capable of handling a simple room clearing by herself." The challenge was obvious and deliberate. Coleman was betting that Maria would either refuse the order, which would give him grounds to question her courage and leadership potential, or attempt the solo breach and fail, proving his point about female soldiers being unsuited for combat roles. Maria studied Coleman's face for a moment, reading the satisfaction in his eyes as he presented her with what he clearly believed was an impossible choice. She understood that this moment would define not just her own future in the unit, but also how female soldiers would be perceived by everyone watching the exercise. "Understood, Master Sergeant," she said simply. "I'll execute the breach alone." Her squad mates exchanged worried glances, but they had learned to trust Maria's judgment over the past few weeks. If she believed she could handle the situation, they would support her decision even if they disagreed with the orders that created it. Maria began her final equipment check with methodical precision. Her rifle was clean and properly zeroed. Her tactical gear was secure and positioned for maximum mobility. Her communications equipment was functioning perfectly. She had trained for scenarios like this countless times, though never under such obviously hostile circumstances. As she approached the building, Maria's mind shifted into combat mode. The noise and distractions of the training environment faded away, replaced by hyper-aware focus on every detail of her surroundings. She could hear Coleman's voice behind her, undoubtedly providing commentary on her approach to the other evaluators. She blocked out his words and concentrated on the task ahead. The building entry went exactly as her training had prepared her for. She moved with fluid efficiency, clearing each room systematically while maintaining awareness of potential threats from multiple directions. Her target was located in the third room she checked, and the simulated capture was executed flawlessly. The entire operation took less than 4 minutes from start to finish. When Maria emerged from the building with her prisoner in tow, a crowd of soldiers had gathered to watch the conclusion of the exercise. Many of them had never seen a solo building breach executed so smoothly, especially not by someone facing obvious institutional hostility. Coleman's expression was a mixture of anger and grudging professional respect. He had expected Maria to fail spectacularly, providing him with the ammunition he needed to argue for her removal from the unit. Instead, she had performed at a level that exceeded even veteran special operations standards. Adequate was all he said in front of the assembled soldiers. But, privately, Coleman was forced to acknowledge that Maria Santos was unlike any soldier he had previously encountered. Her combination of tactical intelligence, physical capability, and unshakable composure under pressure marked her as genuinely exceptional. The realization only made him more determined to find her breaking point. In his worldview, everyone had weaknesses that could be exploited with sufficient pressure and creativity. Maria's apparent invulnerability was simply a challenge that required a more sophisticated approach. That evening, as Maria cleaned her equipment and prepared for the next day's training, she reflected on the obvious escalation in Coleman's campaign against her. She had handled his latest test successfully, but she knew he wouldn't give up easily. Men like Coleman rarely accepted defeat gracefully, especially when it challenged their fundamental beliefs about themselves and the world around them. What she didn't anticipate was how far he would be willing to go to prove his point. Over the next several days, Coleman's behavior became increasingly erratic and personal. He began finding excuses to single her out for punishment details, assigning her to menial tasks that had nothing to do with her actual job responsibilities. He questioned her decisions in front of subordinates, undermining her authority and attempting to damage her reputation among the enlisted soldiers. The unit's other squad leaders began to notice Coleman's behavior, but military protocol made it difficult for them to intervene directly. Challenging a master sergeant's treatment of his subordinates was a serious matter that could have career-ending consequences for anyone who chose to get involved. Private Johnson approached Maria after one particularly obvious incident where Coleman had publicly berated her for an imaginary equipment deficiency. "Staff Sergeant, this isn't right," he said quietly. "Everyone can see what's happening. Maybe you should talk to the first sergeant or the company commander." Maria appreciated the young soldier's concern, but she also understood the larger dynamics at play. "I can handle it, Johnson, but I appreciate you looking out for me. It's not fair, though. You're one of the best soldiers in the unit. Hell, you're better than most of the squad leaders I've served under." "Coleman's just being careful," Maria interrupted gently. "I know you mean well, but talking that way about senior NCOs can get you in trouble. Focus on your own development, and let me worry about my situation with the master sergeant." But privately, Maria was beginning to prepare herself for the inevitable confrontation. Coleman's behavior was escalating toward a breaking point. and she sensed that something dramatic was coming soon. She had survived similar situations before by staying calm, professional, and unshakable, but she also recognized that Coleman was more persistent and vindictive than most of her previous antagonists. The tension in the unit was becoming palpable. Soldiers were beginning to choose sides, with most supporting Maria and a small group remaining loyal to Coleman out of either fear or shared prejudices. The division was affecting unit cohesion and mission readiness, exactly the outcome that military leaders worked hardest to avoid. Something would have to give soon, and Maria suspected that when it did, the confrontation would be unlike anything she had previously experienced. Coleman was running out of subtle ways to undermine her, which meant his next move would likely be direct, personal, and designed to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever punishment he had in mind. As she settled into her bunk that night, Maria mentally prepared herself for whatever was coming. She had faced worse odds before and emerged stronger. But she also understood that her response to Coleman's inevitable escalation would determine not just her own future, but also the future of every female soldier who might serve in similar units. The confrontation that would define both their careers came on a humid Thursday morning during what should have been routine combat training. The unit was practicing defensive positions and small unit tactics, skills that every soldier needed to master regardless of their specific military occupational specialty. Maria had been assigned to lead a squad through a complex patrol exercise, a responsibility that reflected her growing reputation as a competent leader. Master Sergeant Coleman had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing, which made Maria more alert than usual. In her experience, his silence often preceded his most aggressive attempts to undermine her authority. She had learned to recognize the signs, the way his jaw tightened when she spoke, how his eyes followed her movements with predatory focus, and the subtle changes in his posture that indicated building anger. The patrol began without incident. Maria's squad moved through the training area with practiced efficiency, following standard operating procedures while adapting to the challenging terrain. She had earned the trust and respect of her team members through consistent competence and genuine concern for their development as soldiers. Unlike many senior enlisted soldiers, she took time to explain her decisions and help junior personnel understand the reasoning behind tactical choices. Corporal Martinez had become particularly devoted to her leadership style. Santos actually teaches instead of just barking orders, he had told his friends in other squads. She makes you think about why you're doing something, not just what you're supposed to do. That's the mark of a real leader. The sentiment was shared by most of the soldiers who had worked directly with Maria. She had a natural ability to inspire confidence while maintaining the discipline necessary for military effectiveness. Even some of the unit's senior non-commissioned officers had begun to acknowledge that she represented the kind of professional competence the Army needed to cultivate. But Coleman's hostility had only intensified as Maria's reputation grew. He viewed her success as a personal attack on everything he believed about military tradition and proper order. In his mind, every compliment she received was an implicit criticism of his own leadership methods. Every success she achieved was evidence that the Army was abandoning the principles that had made it effective. The breaking point came when Maria's squad encountered a simulated ambush scenario that required quick thinking and decisive action. The exercise was designed to test leadership under pressure, forcing squad leaders to make rapid decisions with incomplete information while managing the stress of simulated combat. Maria handled the situation with characteristic competence. She quickly assessed the tactical situation, identified the most likely enemy positions, and began coordinating her squad's response. Her orders were clear, calm, and tactically sound. Within minutes, she had maneuvered her team into a position where they could effectively neutralize the simulated threat while minimizing their own exposure to enemy fire. Coleman watched the exercise unfold from his position as the primary evaluator, his frustration growing with each competent decision Maria made. This was supposed to be the scenario that exposed her weaknesses and proved his point about female soldiers being unsuited for combat leadership. Instead, she was demonstrating exactly the kind of tactical intelligence and composure under pressure that the Army valued most. As the exercise concluded with Maria's squad successfully completing their mission objectives, Coleman made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of acknowledging her competent performance, he decided to create a confrontation that would force her to reveal what he was certain were her underlying weaknesses. "Santos," he shouted across the training area. "Front and center." Maria instructed her squad to maintain their positions and jogged over to where Coleman was standing. She assumed he wanted to discuss some aspect of the exercise or provide guidance for the next phase of training. Nothing in his tone or demeanor suggested what was actually about to happen. "Yes, Master Sergeant," she said, coming to attention in front of him. Coleman looked around the training area, noting how many soldiers were within earshot of their conversation. This was exactly what he wanted, a public confrontation that would establish his dominance and put Maria in her place once and for all. "Your performance during that exercise was completely unacceptable," he said loudly enough for nearby soldiers to hear clearly. "Your tactical decisions were questionable, your communication was inadequate, and your leadership showed a fundamental misunderstanding of combat principles." Maria felt her stomach tighten with a familiar mixture of anger and disappointment. She had expected criticism. Coleman never missed an opportunity to find fault with her performance, but the specific nature of his complaints was clearly false. Everyone who had observed the exercise could see that her squad had performed exceptionally well under her leadership. "Master Sergeant, could you be more specific about which aspects of my performance need improvement?" she asked, keeping her voice level and professional. "Are you questioning my evaluation, Staff Sergeant?" Coleman stepped closer, using his physical presence to intimidate. At 6 feet 2 inches and over 200 pounds of muscle, he was accustomed to using his size to dominate conversations with subordinates. "No, Master Sergeant, I'm requesting specific feedback so I can improve my performance in future exercises." But Coleman wasn't interested in constructive feedback. He had decided that this was the moment to break her spirit and prove his point about female soldiers once and for all. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their military careers. "You want specific feedback?" Coleman's voice rose to a shout. "Here's your feedback. You're weak, you're incompetent, and you have no business leading soldiers in combat. You're a liability to this unit and a danger to every soldier under your command." The training area fell silent as soldiers stopped what they were doing to stare at the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Many of them had served under Maria's leadership and knew that Coleman's assessment was not only wrong but deliberately malicious. But military protocol made it almost impossible for them to intervene without serious consequences to their own careers. Maria absorbed the verbal assault without visible reaction, though inside she was calculating her options carefully. She understood that Coleman was trying to provoke her into an emotional response that would justify whatever punishment he had planned. Her best strategy was to remain calm and professional regardless of how personal his attacks became. "I understand your concerns, Master Sergeant," she replied evenly. "If you could provide specific examples of my tactical errors, I would appreciate the opportunity to learn from them." Her composed response only made Coleman angrier. He had expected her to break down, to show the emotional instability he was certain lay beneath her professional facade. Instead, she was responding with exactly the kind of disciplined professionalism that made her so effective as a leader. "Don't try to play word games with me, Santos," he snarled, stepping even closer until he was standing directly in front of her. "I know exactly what you are. You're nothing but a politically correct experiment that's putting real soldiers at risk. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The personal nature of his attack crossed a line that made several soldiers visibly uncomfortable. Sergeant First Class Williams, one of the unit's most respected leaders, took a step forward as if preparing to intervene. But before he could act, Coleman made the mistake that would define the rest of the confrontation. In his anger and frustration, Coleman abandoned the last pretense of professional conduct. He reached out and grabbed Maria by the shoulder, spinning her around and forcing her to face the assembled soldiers. The physical contact was clearly intended to humiliate her and demonstrate his dominance in front of the entire unit. "Look at her!" he shouted to the watching soldiers. This is what the army thinks passes for a combat leader these days. A weak little girl who couldn't handle a real fight if her life depended on it. For Coleman, the moment represented the culmination of weeks of building frustration. He had finally found a way to publicly humiliate Maria and prove his point about female soldiers. In his mind, she would either break down crying or lose her temper, either of which would validate his beliefs and justify his treatment of her. What he didn't expect was Maria's reaction. The instant Coleman's hand touched her shoulder, something fundamental shifted in Maria's demeanor. The composed professional facade didn't crack. It was replaced by something far more dangerous. Years of combat training, street survival instincts, and disciplined self-control combined into a response that none of the watching soldiers had anticipated. Maria's movement was so fast and fluid that many observers missed the actual technique. One moment Coleman was gripping her shoulder and shouting at the assembled soldiers. The next moment he was face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that left him completely helpless. The silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier in the training area stared in shock at the sight of their master sergeant, immobilized by the woman he had been trying to humiliate just seconds before. Coleman struggled briefly against the hold, but Maria's technique was perfect. The more he fought, the more pressure she applied to joints that could be easily damaged if he continued to resist. "Master Sergeant," Maria said calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent training area, "I'm going to release this hold now. I respectfully request that you refrain from putting your hands on me again without my permission." The words were spoken with such professional courtesy that they seemed almost surreal given the circumstances. Maria had just demonstrated physical dominance over a larger, stronger opponent, but she was still maintaining military protocol and showing appropriate respect for rank structure. Coleman's face burned with humiliation and rage as he realized what had just happened. In his attempt to prove Maria's weakness, he had instead revealed his own. Every soldier in the unit had just watched him get overpowered by the woman he claimed was incompetent. The damage to his credibility and authority was immediate and irreversible. As Maria released the hold and stepped back, Coleman scrambled to his feet with as much dignity as he could manage. His uniform was dirty, his pride was shattered, and his authority over the unit had been fundamentally undermined. But what hurt most was the knowledge that he had brought this humiliation entirely upon himself. The watching soldiers remained frozen in place, uncertain how to process what they had just witnessed. Military hierarchy and protocol had been turned upside down in a matter of seconds. A staff sergeant had physically dominated a master sergeant, but she had done it in response to his inappropriate physical contact, and with such professional restraint that it was difficult to categorize her actions as insubordination. Private Johnson would later describe the moment to his friends as the most badass thing I've ever seen in the Army. But at the time, he was simply stunned by the speed and efficiency of Maria's response. 1 second, Coleman was grabbing her and yelling, and the next second, he was eating dirt. I didn't even see how she did it. Corporal Martinez had a clearer view of the actual technique. It was like watching a martial arts demonstration, he would tell people later. Smooth, controlled, and absolutely perfect. She could have seriously hurt him if she wanted to, but she just immobilized him and then let him go with a polite request to keep his hands to himself. It was professional as hell, which somehow made it even more devastating. For Maria, the moment represented both a victory and a potential career disaster. She had successfully defended herself against inappropriate physical contact from a superior, but she had also just assaulted a master sergeant in front of dozens of witnesses. Regardless of the circumstances, her actions could be interpreted as a serious violation of military law. As Coleman dusted himself off and tried to salvage some semblance of authority, Maria came to attention and waited for whatever consequences would follow. She had made a split-second decision to defend herself, and she was prepared to face whatever charges might result from that choice. What neither of them anticipated was how the incident would be interpreted by the soldiers who had witnessed it, and how quickly word would spread throughout the entire base about the day a staff sergeant taught a master sergeant a lesson in respect, professionalism, and the proper treatment of subordinates. The minutes following the confrontation passed in a surreal silence that no one quite knew how to break. Master Sergeant Coleman stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions ranging from rage to humiliation to something approaching fear. The assembled soldiers remained at their positions, unsure whether they should continue with training or wait for orders from their visibly shaken leader. Maria maintained her position of attention, though her mind was racing through potential consequences and responses. She had acted on instinct when Coleman grabbed her, drawing on years of martial arts training and street survival skills that were deeply ingrained in her muscle memory. The technique she had used was designed to immobilize an attacker without causing permanent injury, but she knew that the military justice system might not make such distinctions. The standoff was finally broken by the arrival of First Sergeant Robert Hayes, who had been conducting equipment inspections in a nearby building when someone reported the incident. Hayes was a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, known for his fairness and professional competence. More importantly, he had been watching the situation between Coleman and Maria with growing concern over the past several weeks. "What's the situation here?" Hayes asked as he approached, his experienced eyes taking in the body language of everyone present. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could tell immediately that something significant had occurred. Coleman attempted to regain control of the narrative. "First Sergeant, Staff Sergeant Santos just physically assaulted me in front of the entire unit. She needs to be arrested and charged with assault on a senior non-commissioned officer." Hayes looked from Coleman to Maria, noting the Master Sergeant's disheveled appearance and the composed demeanor of the accused. He had seen enough military confrontations to recognize when he was getting only part of the story. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said formally, "what's your version of events?" Maria chose her words carefully, understanding that her military career potentially hung in the balance. "First Sergeant, Master Sergeant Coleman was providing feedback on my performance during the exercise. When he placed his hands on me without my consent, I used appropriate defensive techniques to protect myself. I then requested that he refrain from physical contact and immediately released the restraining hold." The clinical precision of her report contrasted sharply with Coleman's emotional accusations. Hayes had dealt with enough disciplinary situations to recognize the difference between a professional accounting of events and an attempt to cover up misconduct. "Were there witnesses to this incident?" Hayes asked, though the answer was obvious given the number of soldiers present. Sergeant First Class Williams stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. He had served under Coleman for 2 years and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the Master Sergeant's treatment of Maria. This incident had finally crossed a line that he couldn't ignore. "First Sergeant, I witnessed the entire confrontation," Williams said formally. Master Sergeant Coleman was providing what he characterized as performance feedback to Staff Sergeant Santos. During this feedback session, he made physical contact with Staff Sergeant Santos by grabbing her shoulder and forcibly turning her to face the assembled soldiers. Staff Sergeant Santos then used what appeared to be appropriate defensive techniques to disengage from the unwanted contact. Williams paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. Speaking against a Master Sergeant was a serious matter that could have significant career implications, but his sense of professional integrity compelled him to continue. "First Sergeant, in my opinion, Master Sergeant Coleman's actions constituted inappropriate physical contact with a subordinate." Staff Sergeant Santos' response appeared to be proportionate self-defense rather than assault. The formal nature of Williams' statement carried significant weight. As a senior squad leader with an impeccable service record, his testimony would be difficult for any investigator to dismiss. More importantly, his willingness to speak up encouraged other soldiers to come forward with their own observations. Corporal Martinez stepped forward next. "First Sergeant, I also witnessed the incident." Staff Sergeant Santos was responding professionally to Master Sergeant Coleman's feedback when he grabbed her shoulder. Her response was immediate but controlled. She immobilized him without causing injury and released him as soon as he stopped struggling. One by one, Other soldiers began providing similar accounts. The pattern that emerged was consistent. Coleman had initiated unwanted physical contact, and Maria had responded with minimal necessary force to protect herself. None of the witnesses characterized her actions as aggressive or excessive. Coleman realized that his version of events was being systematically contradicted by multiple credible witnesses. His face reddened as he understood that his attempt to destroy Maria's career had instead exposed his own inappropriate conduct to official scrutiny. "These soldiers are obviously biased in favor of Santos," he said desperately. "They're protecting her because she's manipulated them into thinking she's some kind of hero. You can't trust their testimony." Hayes studied Coleman's face for a long moment, recognizing the signs of a leader who had lost the respect and trust of his subordinates. In 20 years of military service, he had seen careers destroyed by exactly this kind of situation. Senior leaders who allowed personal prejudices to override professional judgment and ended up compromising their own integrity. "Master Sergeant Coleman," Hayes said carefully, "I'm going to recommend that you report to the company commander immediately to provide your statement regarding this incident. Staff Sergeant Santos, you will also need to provide a formal written statement. All witnesses should prepare written accounts of what they observed." The formal nature of Hayes' response made it clear that this incident would be thoroughly investigated through official channels. Coleman's hopes of simply punishing Maria and moving on were obviously unrealistic. Instead, both of their careers would now be subject to intense scrutiny from higher authorities. As the soldiers began to disperse to prepare their statements, small groups formed to discuss what they had witnessed. The consensus among most of the unit was that Maria had acted appropriately under difficult circumstances, while Coleman had crossed a line that should never be crossed between senior leaders and their subordinates. Private Johnson expressed what many of the junior enlisted soldiers were thinking. "Santos has been nothing but professional since she got here. Coleman's been looking for excuses to mess with her from day one. Today he went too far and got what he deserved." The sentiment wasn't limited to junior soldiers. Staff Sergeant Williams found himself fielding questions from squad leaders throughout the unit who had heard about the incident and wanted more details. His account of Coleman's inappropriate behavior confirmed suspicions that many senior non-commissioned officers had harbored but been reluctant to voice. "I've been watching this situation develop for weeks," Williams told Sergeant First Class Thompson, one of the company's most respected leaders. "Coleman's been way out of line with Santos, but she's handled it professionally every time. Today, he finally pushed her too far, and she showed him exactly what kind of soldier she really is." Thompson nodded grimly. "I was afraid something like this was going to happen. Coleman's old-school mentality is one thing, but personal vendettas have no place in a professional military unit. He's lucky Santos showed restraint. A lot of soldiers would have done a lot worse if someone grabbed them like that." Word of the incident spread throughout the base with the speed that military gossip typically achieves. By evening chow, soldiers throughout the brigade were discussing the confrontation between Master Sergeant Coleman and Staff Sergeant Santos. The story grew in the telling, but the basic facts remained consistent. A female soldier had been physically grabbed by a senior male leader and had responded by demonstrating superior combat skills and professional restraint. The reaction from different parts of the military community was revealing. Older, more traditional soldiers were divided between respect for Maria's competence and concern about the breakdown of military hierarchy. Younger soldiers were almost universally supportive of her actions, viewing them as an appropriate response to workplace harassment. Female soldiers throughout the base saw the incident as a vindication of their own capabilities and a warning to anyone who might consider treating them unprofessionally. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, the company commander, spent most of the afternoon interviewing witnesses and reviewing the formal statements that had been submitted. What emerged was a clear pattern of escalating harassment by Coleman, culminating in inappropriate physical contact that justified Maria's defensive response. Rodriguez was a West Point graduate with 6 years of commissioned service, including a combat deployment to Afghanistan. She had dealt with similar situations before and understood both the legal and leadership implications of what had occurred. Her primary concern was ensuring that justice was served while maintaining unit cohesion and professional standards. Her interview with Maria revealed a soldier who was clearly shaken by the experience, but remained committed to serving professionally regardless of the personal consequences. "Captain, I understand that my actions may be viewed as inappropriate regardless of the circumstances," Maria said during the formal interview. "I accept full responsibility for my response to Master Sergeant Coleman's conduct." "Staff Sergeant Santos," Rodriguez replied, "based on the witness statements I've reviewed, your actions appear to have been appropriate self-defense against unwanted physical contact. The issue isn't whether you were justified in protecting yourself. The issue is whether Master Sergeant Coleman's conduct was appropriate for a senior leader in this unit." The captain's words provided Maria with the first indication that the official investigation might not automatically result in punishment for her actions. She had prepared herself for court-martial proceedings and potential imprisonment, but the emerging evidence suggested that Coleman's conduct was being viewed as the primary problem. Rodriguez's interview with Coleman was far less comfortable. The Master Sergeant's version of events was inconsistent with witness testimony and revealed a pattern of personal animosity that raised serious questions about his fitness for leadership positions. More troubling were his attempts to justify his physical contact with Maria and his obvious inability to understand why his conduct was problematic. "Master Sergeant," Rodriguez said after listening to his statement, "help me understand why you felt it was necessary to put your hands on Staff Sergeant Santos during what you've described as a performance counseling session." "I was trying to make a point about her leadership style," Coleman replied, still apparently unaware of how his words sounded to a professional military officer. "Sometimes you have to be physical to get through to people who aren't responding to verbal instruction." Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten as she realized the depth of Coleman's misunderstanding regarding appropriate leadership methods. His casual attitude toward unwanted physical contact with subordinates suggested problems that extended far beyond this single incident. "Master Sergeant Coleman," she said carefully, "physical contact with subordinates is not an appropriate leadership technique under any circumstances. Your conduct towards Staff Sergeant Santos appears to have been both unprofessional and inappropriate. I'm recommending that you be relieved of your current duties pending a thorough investigation by the military police." The words hit Coleman like a physical blow. He had expected Maria to be punished for assaulting a senior leader, not to find himself facing potential criminal charges for harassment and inappropriate conduct. His attempt to destroy her career had instead exposed his own unfitness for leadership and put his own future in jeopardy. As the formal investigation began, the ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread throughout the unit and the broader military community. Maria's response to Coleman's harassment had become a symbol for many soldiers who had faced similar challenges, but lacked the skills or confidence to defend themselves effectively. The incident also raised broader questions about leadership, respect, and the proper treatment of all soldiers regardless of gender, race, or background. For many observers, Maria's professional competence and restrained response to provocation represented the kind of soldier the modern military needed to cultivate and protect. But perhaps most importantly, the confrontation had demonstrated that bullying and harassment would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or seniority. The message was clear: professional standards applied to everyone, and those who violated those standards would face appropriate consequences regardless of their position in the hierarchy. The formal investigation that followed the confrontation between Master Sergeant Coleman and Staff Sergeant Santos became a watershed moment for the entire 2nd Brigade combat team. Military police investigators spent 2 weeks interviewing witnesses, reviewing training records, and examining the pattern of interactions between the two soldiers. What they discovered was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez had suspected that Coleman's harassment of Maria was part of a broader pattern, but the investigation revealed the true scope of his inappropriate behavior. Over the previous 3 years, Coleman had systematically targeted female soldiers in the unit, using his position of authority to create hostile work environments that had driven several promising soldiers to request transfers or leave the military entirely. The testimony from previous victims was devastating. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chun, who had transferred to another unit 6 months earlier, provided detailed accounts of Coleman's attempts to undermine her authority and question her competence based solely on her gender. Private First Class Amanda Williams described instances where Coleman had used inappropriate physical contact and sexual innuendo to make her uncomfortable during routine training exercises. Most damning was the testimony of former specialist Sarah Matthews, who had been forced to leave the Army after Coleman's harassment contributed to a mental health crisis that required extensive treatment. Her written statement detailed months of psychological abuse disguised as professional criticism, creating an environment so toxic that she had ultimately chosen to forfeit her military career rather than continue serving under his leadership. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Coleman had used his rank and authority to systematically harass female soldiers, driving away talented personnel and creating an environment that violated every principle of military professionalism. Maria's case was unique only in that she had possessed the skills and confidence necessary to defend herself when his behavior escalated to physical contact. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison, the battalion commander, reviewed the investigation findings with a mixture of anger and professional embarrassment. As a combat veteran with 15 years of commissioned service, he understood that Coleman's conduct reflected poorly on the entire chain of command that had allowed it to continue unchecked. This is exactly the kind of toxic leadership that undermines everything we're trying to accomplish, Harrison told his executive officer during a private briefing. We talk about building an inclusive professional military force, and then we have senior leaders actively sabotaging those efforts through personal prejudice and abuse of authority. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the scope of Coleman's misconduct became clear. Military prosecutors filed charges including harassment, assault, conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and violation of equal opportunity regulations. The evidence was so overwhelming that Coleman's Military Defense Counsel advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face the more serious charges that would result from a court-martial trial. Coleman's final appearance before the military court was a stark contrast to the confident, domineering figure who had terrorized subordinates for years. Stripped of his rank insignia and facing the end of his 20-year military career, he appeared diminished and defeated as he accepted responsibility for his actions and submitted to the court's judgment. The sentence was comprehensive and final. Coleman was reduced in rank to private, forfeited all pay and allowances, and received a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. More importantly, for his victims, he was banned from any future federal employment and would carry the stigma of his dishonorable discharge for the rest of his civilian life. Judge Advocate General Colonel Patricia Stevens delivered the sentence with the gravity appropriate to the crimes. Master Sergeant Coleman, she said, your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in you as a senior leader. You used your authority not to develop and protect your subordinates, but to harass and intimidate them based on personal prejudice. Such conduct has no place in the United States Army or any professional organization. For Maria, watching Coleman's downfall was both satisfying and sobering. She had never intended to destroy anyone's career, but she understood that his removal from the military was necessary to protect future soldiers from similar abuse. Her own actions during the confrontation had been vindicated by the investigation, which concluded that she had used appropriate force to defend herself against unwanted physical contact. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond the punishment of one toxic leader. The investigation's findings prompted a comprehensive review of leadership practices throughout the brigade, with particular attention to the treatment of female soldiers and other historically marginalized groups. New training programs were implemented to help leaders recognize and address harassment before it escalated to the level of Coleman's conduct. First Sergeant Robert Hayes found himself at the center of these reform efforts. His quick and professional response to the initial incident had earned him recognition from higher authorities, and he was assigned to lead the development of new leadership standards for the entire division. The Coleman case taught us that we can't wait for problems to solve themselves, Hayes explained during a leadership conference 6 months later. When we see toxic behavior developing, we have to address it immediately and decisively. Every day we allow inappropriate conduct to continue is another day we're failing our soldiers and our mission. The training programs that emerged from the investigation were revolutionary in their scope and effectiveness. Rather than focusing solely on legal compliance, they emphasized the practical benefits of inclusive leadership and professional respect for all service members. Soldiers learned that diversity wasn't just a political requirement, but a tactical advantage that made units more effective and resilient. Maria found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of a symbol for military reform. Her competent response to harassment and her professional handling of a dangerous situation had made her a hero to many soldiers throughout the Army. Speaking requests poured in from bases around the world, seeking her perspective on leadership, professionalism, and the proper response to workplace harassment. Initially uncomfortable with the attention, Maria gradually came to understand that her experience could help other soldiers facing similar challenges. Her speaking engagements focused not on her martial arts skills or the dramatic confrontation with Coleman, but on the importance of professional standards, mutual respect, and creating inclusive environments where all soldiers could succeed. The real lesson isn't about fighting back physically, she told an audience of junior officers at Fort Leavenworth. The real lesson is about maintaining professional standards and treating every soldier with the respect they've earned through their service. When leaders forget that basic principle, they create problems that hurt everyone in the unit. Her messages resonated particularly strongly with female soldiers who had faced similar challenges but lacked the confidence or skills to respond effectively. Many reached out to thank her for proving that competence and professionalism could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. Captain Rodriguez, who had overseen the initial investigation, was promoted to major and assigned to develop military-wide policies for preventing harassment and toxic leadership. Her experience with the Coleman case had convinced her that systematic reforms were necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. Individual cases like Coleman's are symptoms of broader cultural problems, she explained to a Senate subcommittee examining military culture issues. We need to fundamentally change how we select, train, and evaluate military leaders to ensure that personal prejudices never override professional responsibilities. The reforms that emerged from the Coleman case became a model for military installations worldwide. Zero-tolerance policies for harassment were strengthened and more consistently enforced. Leadership selection processes were revised to emphasize emotional intelligence and inclusive management skills alongside traditional military competencies. Most importantly, soldiers at all levels were empowered to report inappropriate behavior without fear of retaliation. The unit that had once been divided by Coleman's toxic leadership gradually transformed into one of the most cohesive and effective formations in the entire brigade. Soldiers who had previously walked on eggshells around their leadership began to thrive under new commanders who valued competence over conformity and results over politics. Corporal Martinez, who had witnessed the original confrontation, was promoted to sergeant and assigned as a squad leader himself. His leadership style was directly influenced by what he had learned from watching Maria's professional competence under pressure. Santos taught us that real leaders don't need to intimidate or harass people to get results. He explained to his new subordinates during his first squad meeting. Real leaders earn respect through competence, fairness, and genuine concern for their soldiers' development. That's the standard we're going to maintain in this squad. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the military community for years after the incident. Military academies incorporated the Coleman case into their ethics curricula as an example of how personal prejudices could corrupt professional judgment. Leadership development programs used Maria's response as a model for maintaining professional standards under extreme pressure. Perhaps most importantly, the case became a turning point in military culture regarding the treatment of female soldiers. The old arguments about women being too weak or emotional for combat roles were permanently discredited by Maria's demonstration of superior tactical skills, physical competence, and emotional control under pressure. 5 years after the confrontation, Maria had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and was serving as a senior instructor at the Army's prestigious Ranger School. Her students included both male and female soldiers who would go on to lead combat units around the world. The lessons she taught about leadership, professionalism, and tactical competence were informed by her understanding that true strength came not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the confidence to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. In her final evaluation of the incident's long-term impact, Maria reflected on how a moment of crisis had become an opportunity for positive change throughout the military. Coleman's attempt to destroy her career had instead exposed and eliminated a toxic leader while strengthening the institution's commitment to professional excellence and inclusive leadership. The most important thing wasn't that I was able to defend myself physically, she wrote in a professional journal article that became required reading at military leadership schools. The most important thing was that the system ultimately worked the way it was supposed to work. When professional standards were violated, appropriate consequences followed. When soldiers needed protection from toxic leadership, they received it. That's what a professional military looks like, and that's what we should expect from ourselves and our leaders. The transformation was complete, but the lessons learned from that humid Thursday morning at Fort Campbell continued to influence military culture for generations. A single moment of courage had sparked institutional change that protected countless soldiers from the kind of harassment and abuse that had once been tolerated as an inevitable part of military life. Master Sergeant Coleman had intended to prove that female soldiers had no place in combat units. Instead, he had demonstrated that toxic leaders had no place in a professional military, regardless of their rank, experience, or personal beliefs. The Army that emerged from the reforms sparked by his downfall was stronger, more inclusive, and more effective than the organization he had tried to preserve through intimidation and prejudice. For Maria Santos, the confrontation that could have ended her career had instead become the foundation for a legacy of professional excellence and institutional reform that would benefit soldiers for decades to come. Sometimes, standing up for what is right in a single moment of crisis can change everything that follows.